She stepped onto the plane, her heart pounding not because of turbulence but because of what she knew would come next. At 17, Sarah Mitchell carried more than just a carry-on suitcase. She carried the weight of her illness, constantly checking her blood sugar, holding on to her ticket for first class like a lifeline she'd earned fairly. When she handed her boarding pass to the flight attendant, the response cut through her like ice. "This is not your seat." Right then, in that moment, the cabin shifted. A well-dressed executive in silence hovered nearby, smug confidence in her posture. Passengers turned, breath held. Sarah stood frozen, not sure whether to fight or to disappear. Did that boarding pass matter if no one was willing to look? A father seated just 2 rows back watched his daughter's dignity under assault. What he would do next would leave every person on that flight speechless. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Who really belonged in that seat? Was it Sarah Mitchell, a 17-year-old diabetic girl who had studied tirelessly for weeks, saving every ounce of strength to make it onto this flight? Or was it the well-dressed executive who stood with folded arms, staring at her as though Sarah's very presence in first class was an offense? The question lingered in the stale cabin air. Why was this young girl targeted? Was it simply a mistake on the airline's part, an error of paperwork? Or was it something far more unsettling, an unspoken assumption that a girl like Sarah could never belong in the luxury section of the plane? Passengers looked away, but whispers spread through the aisle. And then, there was her father, David Mitchell. To the casual eye, he was just another businessman in his tailored suit, seated quietly and watching. But who was he really? And how did his true identity turn humiliation into a moment the airline would never forget? Was this a clash of privilege or a sharp reminder of prejudice? Was it just one flight attendant's decision, or a reflection of something bigger, something systemic, something passengers had seen before, but never had the courage to confront? And most importantly, what would you have done if you were there, staring at Sarah clutching her ticket with trembling hands, while her father prepared to speak? Because what David Mitchell did next would not only silence the passengers in that cabin, it would send ripples far beyond the walls of the aircraft, forcing an entire industry to reckon with the truth it had avoided for too long. Nina Carter was only 17, but her story already carried more weight than most adults could imagine. Living with diabetes meant every day was a careful balance of calculations, glucose monitoring, and carrying emergency supplies no matter where she went. For Nina, even a simple flight wasn't just travel, it was survival. The first-class seat her father booked wasn't about luxury. It was about stability. It meant space, to keep her insulin and medical devices within reach, access to staff who could respond quickly in an emergency, and the peace of mind that her fragile health wouldn't be compromised in a crowded, chaotic cabin. But Nina was far more than her illness. She was brilliant, already being recognized for her invention, a wearable device designed to help autistic children communicate with their families. What began as a school project had grown into something extraordinary, gaining attention from educators and specialists alike. The very reason for this flight was tied to that invention. She was headed to a conference where her work could change lives. And so, that first-class seat mattered for reasons beyond comfort. It symbolized dignity, purpose, and her right to be taken seriously. But in that same aisle, another figure cast a shadow over Nina's moment. Charlotte Reynolds, a corporate executive in her mid-40s, sharp suit pressed to perfection, platinum frequent flyer card tucked neatly beside her passport. Charlotte had built her reputation on ambition alone, climbing ladders, stepping on hands if necessary, making sure no one forgot her status. On countless flights before this one, she had been the first to demand an upgrade, the first to question who sat beside her, the first to remind staff that she, above all, was deserving of every privilege. Entitlement followed her like perfume. To her, people like Nina were invisible unless, of course, they were in her way. Then, there was David Carter, Nina's father. To the strangers seated around him, he seemed ordinary, A man in his early 50s, polite, quiet, almost understated. Few knew the truth that this was the billionaire founder of one of the most transformative tech companies in America. A man who had once coded in a freezing basement apartment as a broke college student, surviving on instant noodles and determination. A man who built his fortune not by inheritance or luck, but by vision and relentless work. Yet despite his wealth, David Carter had always chosen humility. He avoided the spotlight when possible. He blended in deliberately, preferring to watch people's actions rather than flaunt his own. And so, as his daughter stood at the center of a storm she did not create, David said nothing at first. He observed. He listened. He measured the silence of the passengers, the authority in the flight attendant's voice, the dismissive smirk of Charlotte Reynolds. Because this wasn't just about a seat, it was about power, perception, and a silent test of character. And soon that test would reveal who truly belonged in that cabin and who didn't. The air inside the cabin of Flight 847 felt heavier than usual, though no one could explain why. At the very front in Seat 1A, Nina Carter stood frozen. Her slim frame carried both her backpack and the invisible burden of her illness, her insulin kit pressed tight against her side. Her seat was occupied by Charlotte Reynolds. Charlotte had draped her coat over the armrest, placed her handbag neatly beneath the seat, and reclined as though she had earned permanent ownership of that space. When Nina politely explained that Seat 1A was hers, Charlotte's response was cool, sharp, and dismissive. "This is my seat. You must be mistaken." Nina's voice wavered at first, but then steadied. She clutched her boarding pass with trembling hands, extending it toward the nearby attendant. Maria Lopez, the flight attendant assigned to first class, approached with a practiced smile. But behind her eyes there was something else, a subtle hesitation. She glanced at Charlotte, then at Nina, and her expression hardened. "Ma'am," she said to Nina in a measured tone, "are you sure you're in the right section?" The implication was clear. Passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. A low murmur rippled through the cabin. Phones were discreetly lifted, recording the scene as if everyone sensed what was unfolding would not be forgotten. Nina swallowed hard, pressing her ticket into Maria's hands. "It says 1A, she whispered, her voice steady despite the quiver in her body. David Carter, seated just 2 rows behind, watched intently. He didn't intervene, not yet. He wanted to see how far this would go, how many would look away, how many would speak up. To Nina, the silence of those watching was deafening. For Charlotte, it was validation. She leaned back in her seat, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing at the corner of her lips. To her, this was not about a boarding pass, it was about status. The crowd grew restless. A businessman shifted in his seat. A mother with her child shook her head in quiet disapproval. Yet no one rose. No one interrupted. Maria returned the boarding pass to Nina, her voice now firm. "We'll sort this out, but please step aside." Nina's chest tightened. The glucose monitor on her wrist beeped faintly, a reminder that her body did not have the luxury of delay. Still, she stood her ground, eyes locked on Charlotte, unwilling to retreat from what was rightfully hers. Passengers whispered, "What's going on? Is she really in first class? Why isn't someone doing something?" Every second felt like an eternity, and then, as though the tension had reached its breaking point, Charlotte leaned forward. She smoothed her suit jacket, looked directly at Nina with cold certainty, and prepared to unleash words that would alter the cabin entirely. And that's when Charlotte played her final card. 4 words that would change everything. "Do you know who?" Maria called for backup. Another attendant arrived, tablet in hand, pulling up the airline's passenger manifest. The cabin was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the engines as eyes darted between the screen and the faces of the 2 women locked in silent conflict. The record was clear. Seat 1A was assigned to Nina Carter. Charlotte Reynolds had in fact been bumped down to economy due to an overbooking adjustment, a policy that frustrated many frequent flyers, but was standard practice across the industry. Still, Charlotte's voice rang out with indignation. There's no way. I always fly first class. I'm a platinum member. This has to be a mistake. She straightened in her seat, her tone loud enough for rows behind her to hear, as if sheer force could rewrite the truth appearing on the digital screen. Passengers murmured again, some siding with the airline's explanation, others whispering that surely there must be more to the story. A businessman in the back muttered to his colleague, "Airlines do this all the time. It's nothing new." Yet another voice challenged, "But why was the teenager singled out first? Why did they question her instead of asking the executive to move?" These questions hung heavy in the recycled cabin air, adding another layer of unease. Nina stood silently, her boarding pass still in her hand, shoulders squared, even as her glucose monitor buzzed faintly. She wanted to sink into the floor, but something in her eyes revealed a strength well beyond her 17 years. And just behind her, still seated in business class, David Carter watched. He had not yet revealed himself nor spoken a word. To the passengers, he was another quiet traveler, perhaps too polite or too cautious to interfere. But David was measuring everything. He had seen this before. Memories flickered in his mind. The time a hotel clerk demanded extra identification though his white colleagues checked in without issue. The boardroom where security guards questioned his presence at the very meeting he was leading. The countless flights where attendants ignored him until they realized who he was. Discrimination was not new to David Carter. It was a shadow that had followed him from the days when he was coding in a damp basement apartment to the very heights of his empire. He had learned patience, restraint, the art of watching how people behaved when they believed no one important was watching. Now, he was watching. And as Charlotte continued to protest, her voice growing sharper, passengers divided in whispers, and Nina's dignity hung in the balance. David Carter remained still. But he knew something no one else did. And in just a few moments, he would act. The system confirmed it once again without question. Seat 1A belonged to Nina Carter. Every line of code, every passenger log, every printed receipt echoed the same truth. Charlotte Reynolds, despite her frequent flyer status, had been reassigned to economy. It was an inconvenience, yes, but a perfectly ordinary one in the airline world. Still, Charlotte's voice grew sharper, her tone slicing through the cabin air. "This is absurd. I am a platinum member. I have flown this route dozens of times. I should not be treated like this. Do you know how much I spend with this airline?" She turned toward Maria, demanding, pleading, insisting that surely exceptions could be made. But this time, Maria didn't answer. The flight supervisor, a man in his late 50s with decades of service, stepped forward. He spoke with authority, reminding Charlotte of the facts. Yet Charlotte refused to listen, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "There has to be another way. She can sit somewhere else," she snapped, gesturing toward Nina as if the teenager were an obstacle instead of a passenger with equal rights. Murmurs rippled through the cabin again, this time louder, sharper, fueled by disbelief. And then, quietly, David Carter rose from his seat in business class. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He placed his phone on the armrest, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the confrontation. The cabin seemed to shift with him, a hush falling over passengers as though they sensed something irreversible was about to occur. He stood beside his daughter, resting a steady hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and controlled. "Enough," he said, not raising his voice, yet commanding the attention of every soul on board. Because David Carter wasn't just Nina's father. He was a man who could rewrite the rules of the very airline industry that Charlotte and the crew depended upon. Few passengers knew it then, but David was the founder of Medicis AI, a groundbreaking medical technology company whose diagnostic software powered hospitals, clinics, and most importantly, airline in-flight medical kits worldwide. The very devices stored in the overhead compartments of that plane carried his signature algorithms, the technology he had built from scratch in the shadows of poverty decades earlier. Worth billions, David Carter had risen from obscurity to become one of the most influential minds in modern medicine. His systems had saved countless lives mid-flight when emergencies struck at 30,000 feet. And now, here he was, standing not as a billionaire titan but as a father unwilling to watch his daughter be humiliated. The revelation spread like fire. Passengers whispered his name, some fumbling for their phones to confirm what they had just heard. The flight supervisor's posture shifted, respect etched instantly into his face. Even Maria, who moments before had questioned Nina, now looked stricken, her voice faltering. And Charlotte Reynolds, who just minutes earlier had demanded special treatment, was struck silent, her protests evaporating into the heavy air. The cabin froze in stunned silence, every eye fixed on David Carter, the man whose quiet authority carried more weight than all of Charlotte's status and privilege combined. The silence lingered as if the very walls of the aircraft held their breath. All eyes were fixed on David Carter, waiting for him to leverage his influence, to demand luxury, to summon the privileges his wealth could easily secure. But David had never lived that way, and he wasn't about to start now. He didn't want upgrades. He didn't want apologies wrapped in corporate language. He wanted only one thing: for his daughter, Nina Carter, to sit in the seat that was rightfully hers. With quiet authority, he turned to the supervisor and spoke words that carried more weight than any outburst could. "This isn't about me. This is about my daughter, and about respecting what is fair." Charlotte Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, her face burning crimson as reality closed in. The supervisor's decision was final. With no room left to argue, Charlotte was asked to collect her belongings. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She stood slowly, clutching her handbag like armor as she was escorted down the aisle toward economy. The same passengers who had once averted their eyes now stared openly, watching entitlement dissolve into humiliation. Charlotte's fury was palpable, but so was the undeniable justice of the moment. Nina sat down in seat 1A, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked her medical kit safely beside her. For the first time since boarding, she allowed herself a deep breath. Her father remained beside her for a moment, his eyes softening as he looked at her not as a billionaire, not as a figure of power, but as a man remembering the woman who had helped shape their daughter. David thought of Nina's late mother, whose lessons of strength and dignity echoed in moments like this. She had taught Nina that her worth could never be determined by others, that respect was not something to beg for, but something to stand firmly upon. As the plane prepared for takeoff, passengers reflected quietly. Some were ashamed they hadn't spoken sooner. Others nodded in respect toward David and Nina, understanding they had witnessed something that reached far beyond a seating dispute. For Nina, this was never just a seat. It was the confirmation that her place in the world didn't depend on the approval of executives or the indulgence of strangers. It was hers, earned, rightful, and undeniable. For Nina Carter, Seat 1A became more than a chair on an aircraft. It became a symbol, proof that dignity doesn't need permission. It demands recognition. And for everyone watching, it was a reminder that power used for justice does more than protect the privileged. It levels the ground for those who deserve their space, no matter who doubts them. Was justice truly served that day? Charlotte Reynolds was forced to move, Nina Carter reclaimed her rightful seat, and David Carter revealed not just his power, but his principle. Yet the question lingers, should more have been done? Should the airline have faced consequences beyond the embarrassment of one executive? Or was the real victory found in a teenager's quiet strength and a father's unwavering resolve? And what about you? What would you have done if you were sitting on that plane, watching it all unfold? Would you have spoken up for Nina when she stood trembling with her boarding pass in hand? Or would you, like so many others, have waited in silence, hoping someone else would do the right thing? One thing is certain. The story of Seat 1A was never just about travel. It was about dignity, recognition, and the courage to demand what is fair. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when a maid discovered the billionaire's safe left wide open. What followed next left even the wealthiest man in America speechless. Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if this story moved you, and subscribe for more real-life twists that will leave you speechless.